So when you get restored to God and restored through Jesus, then you discover your true identity. Then you go for a renewal of the mind to remove the negative aspects of the soul's memory and trauma and experiences to bring about the reconnection to the eternal spirit and the memory of who we were before we were here, which gives you a whole enhanced version of identity.
Yeah, I have a very difficult question anyway. It's about why did God create the human race? He knew what would happen. I mean, he knew that we would fall. He knew all the suffering that people had to go through. And so was the purpose, I mean, not that we would suffer, but that he knew that this suffering, this sin coming into the world and we having to make all the choices, was that the way for us to become like the sons he wants us to be? Like Jesus had to go through suffering. Suffering does mature us, not that God wants evil in any way for anybody, but that he knew that this was the only way for us to become like him.
I don't think God is sovereign or knows the future from the perspective he engages with us in, because he lives in every moment with us. So the future doesn't exist until we choose to make it. So I don't think a fixed future already exists and it's going to happen and God knows what's going to happen, because it hadn't happened yet. Now, I know people have different views of time and it being a river flowing in one direction and it being a continuum that it already exists in this continuum. Yes, God is outside of time and space in the eternal now. And that's his transcendent nature, in which he is connected to everybody, but he also lives in every moment with us in the imminent thing. So he's with us in every moment. And he's not in that moment thinking and knowing what's going to happen in that moment or the next moment, because he's living in our moment with us, not from a transcendent outside of time and space perspective. Now, I do believe that God, because he wanted relationship and he created the universe and all that's within it and all the dimensions and everything else for a relational union with him, to ensure that it was always going to happen eventually, and that desire and intention that God had would not be thwarted forever, potentially, Jesus chose to identify with us and include us in him before the foundation of the world. You know, it says you were slain before the foundation of the world. I don't believe, and he didn't die. Obviously, you can't kill God. He didn't die, but he chose to identify with our potential death. And therefore, that preparation was already in place. Therefore, God, according to Ephesians 1:4, God predestined us to this relationship of restored face-to-face innocence, blamelessly innocent in love. So love was the key to it all, because God is love. So can you have love without choice? No.
Yeah.
God chose to love us. Therefore, he created us with choice. Otherwise, he wouldn't love us if he didn't give us choice to love him back.
Yeah.
So you have to choose to love him back. Otherwise, it's not love. So God gave the opportunity for man to enter into a love relationship with him. And in that love relationship, the potential for man to choose not to love was always going to be there. That's inherent in giving man the choice. That's inherent in love. You couldn't choose to create a love, an opportunity of love, without giving someone the choice to love or not love. Otherwise, they're just a robot, programmed.
Yeah.
Well, that's not love. Love's an unconditional choice. So God, knowing that love was the thing, and knowing that love had the potential for man not to love him back, God, through Jesus, enabled restoration to be possible before everything started. So God didn't want us to suffer. God didn't want us to go. If Adam and Eve had not chosen independence, they would have ascended into becoming like God through the process of ascension, through experiences of God that would brought about revelation of him and ascension. But they didn't. Eve chose independence and Adam followed her in that choice. So it's difficult to look at something outside of what you already know, because it's already happened that way. And we know Jesus came to undo everything that the first Adam did as the last Adam. So that Adam introduced death into mankind and into creation, and God introduced life through Jesus. So all died in Adam, all are made alive in Christ. So in that sense, Jesus undid all that Adam did and all Adam and Eve did, and he didn't succumb to the same temptation that they did for independence, because Satan offered him the world and the kingdoms of the world if he would bow down to him.
Yeah, but I mean, if Adam and Eve hadn't fallen, so then everything would have been wonderful from the beginning. But well, then the next people that came, they had not chosen God. And so again, suffering would have happened. So it seems to me, if there is choice, suffering is unavoidable.
Well, no, because they didn't have to choose to follow independence. They could have just chosen to carry on following and relating to God. They didn't have to choose that. But there was obviously an external source that had already chosen independence, which Adam and Eve were given a mandate to overcome. So they were given a sonship mandate to be fruitful and multiply and increase and fill the earth and subdue and overcome and rule in dominion with God.
Yeah.
And they were doing that, and they had obviously overcome up to the point where Eve succumbed to the temptation and chose not to subdue that temptation. And so they already had lots of children. They already were fruitful. They'd already multiplied and increased. And they were already extending the garden until they chose that independent path. Suffering was not present on the earth other than, well, we don't know in one sense, because we don't know the implication, but there was no death. There was no suffering at that point. But there was something to overcome. And the choice is always there of what choice you're going to make, whose direction you're going to follow, whose path are you going to walk in. You know, that's choices we all make every day. Once they chose independence, then they could have been restored at that point. They could have gone through the fiery sword and then gone through the process of refining and purification back into relationship with God at that point, but they didn't. They didn't want to go through the sword, the judgment, and the fire. But others did. Many of their children did not follow them in that path, and they went and followed the path of the tree of life and are in the realms of heaven now, functioning there. But there were others who followed Adam as father rather than God as father, and then they followed Adam back into that path. And ultimately, the choice that Eve made to give access to her DNA created Cain. So you had a different genetic seed within the human possibility, because the serpent seed mixed with the children who were there present, who were Adam's children, and introduced that into the line. And eventually you got Nephilim seed, and you had a mixture of that the enemy was trying to pollute the seed. But God obviously promised that through childbearing, that eventually an heir would be, Jesus would come, who would essentially deal with the enemy on their behalf, which is what he did. So did God intend suffering? No. Does God use suffering to bring good out of it? Yes, because it happens. So God is always good and always wants to bring good out of every situation and choice that we make. And therefore, what we have decided has created suffering in the world. What we have done has allowed evil to flourish. God didn't create evil.
Yeah.
And one sense, the word evil, in one understanding, is hardships, toil, and labor. That's what the word means. Poneros in Greek means hardships, toil, and labor, which is what happened when they followed their own independence. It became hard. They were no longer able to work with creation in symbiosis and harmony and bountiful production. They now had to do things in their own strength, by planting and by the sweat of their own brow, where nothing was hard before that. So there is obviously a lot that's happened, but God didn't create Adam and Eve with the intention that suffering would come into the world, because he knew that it was inevitable that they were going to make that choice, because he lived with them in the moment of imminence with them in relationship. That relationship, if they had continued to follow that relationship, would have led them into maturity. They were not mature. So, like children, they followed their own independence, because they weren't fully mature yet. So God intended their maturity. But also Lucifer was going to be part of that maturity process, in that he was reflecting the 9 firestones from the stones that were on his body to reflect the light of the glory of God that they would have been able to follow and enter into. But obviously Lucifer left that role as well. So there was something missing in God's purposes for their maturity. Now, ultimately, we still can follow that path of maturity back to maturity, and we can follow the path that God has created for us, and we can engage the firestones, and we can engage the tree of life, and we can engage everything that was available to Adam and Eve before they fell. What we cannot have is, well, we can have restored innocence, but we can't have our memory expunged. So before we come into the reality of what God has done for us, we have to, our mind has to be renewed. So we have a memory of what it was like to walk in independence, which then you have to have that renewed and let go of that independence to enter into God's full intention for us. And we still have the choice every day. And you can still choose according to your own memory, or you can choose according to the intentions of God's heart. It's a daily choice. But God never wanted suffering, and God never created evil, and he didn't create us and therefore created evil. He created Lucifer and he created the angelic realm. They chose to operate independently of him and operate in the darkness of the deception of the path that you walk. When you walk away from God and you don't walk in relationship with God, you are walking in darkness and therefore deception, and not in illumination and light and truth. And therefore the truth fades. The knowledge of the truth fades when you walk with independence. So Lucifer would have known the knowledge of the truth, but having chosen, with those fallen angels, chosen to walk independently with another agenda, which was I will be like God, I will ascend, I will have the angelic realm following me. In that whole process, he became deceived himself, and he became clothed in darkness. So therefore, he is not operating out of the knowledge of the truth, which is why things continue that way, which is why when we come into the knowledge of the truth, we can remind those beings of their original identity and purpose, and look up to see them restored to that original identity and purpose, where the scales of darkness will come off their eyes and off their heart, and they will come back into a restored state. But we have to obviously be restored ourselves to be able to do that. So it's an age-old question, why did God make man knowing we were going to fail? Well, he didn't. He didn't create us with that knowledge. He created us in love. And ultimately, see, I do not believe that the future exists. Therefore, I don't believe that God knows the future, because it doesn't exist yet. What he does know is his intention for the future, that we can agree with and bring about or not. Now, it does say in God's foreknowledge. Well, what was he foreknowing? Well, he was foreknowing what Jesus did before the foundation of the world. He was foreknowing that we would be restored to face-to-face innocence in love. That was the foreknowledge. So in foreknowledge, he chose us to be restored. Not he foreknew the terrible things that were going to happen, and therefore condoned it in some way or created it in some way. And I think the sovereignty of God, there are different theological concepts to the sovereignty of God. For some, God is sovereign, therefore everything that happens must be God's will. Well, I don't believe that, because then God's will must be for the suffering that happens and all the terrible things that happen. I mean, the last few days have been terrible things that happened around the world. In Korea, where you had 150 odd people crushed to death and died. In India, where a bridge collapsed and hundreds of last count I saw 140 odd people died. Did God intend that? No, God didn't make that to happen or want that to happen. That was people's choice to do something. The bridge collapsed because someone obviously didn't repair it properly. The crash happened because fear and something happened that caused a stampede. God wasn't sitting there saying, I want evil, I want terrible things to happen. So I don't think God operates in sovereignty like it must be God's will. Then there is a view of sort of the sovereignty of God, that we have choice within the sovereignty of God, but ultimately God's will be accomplished. I personally believe in a more open theistic understanding that God does not know the future in the way that the sovereignty of God has said he knows the future in that way, because I don't believe the future exists until we make a choice to bring it about. But there are different views, obviously, and different people could have different reasons for viewing things that way. I think a hyper-Calvinistic view would be everything is as God wants. You just got to accept that God is good, and therefore the paradoxes that exist are just there. But I don't accept that. I don't accept that God has chosen some and not others. I believe God has good for everybody and wants everyone to be restored to a relationship with him. And therefore, Jesus has already offered to represent us and identify with us before the foundation of the world. That's what I think happened.
But how can he guide us if he doesn't know the future? I mean,
because he's guiding us according to his intention for the future. Okay. His intention for the future is good. His intention for the future is for us to fulfill our destiny, is to be like him. So his intention for the future is aligned to his living in every moment with every person in an imminent state, and want to interact with that person to help guide them into the right choices. Like Jesus only chose to do what he saw the Father doing. Without a relationship with the Father, you don't know his heart. Therefore, you make choices independently of his heart. So God wants a relationship. That's how he wants us to be guided, like Jesus was, to be one with him and therefore only going to make creative choices in alignment with his heart and intention. But we've got the ability to do that and choose to do that in different ways, because he's made us wonderfully, uniquely able to make choices to bring about his will through who we are. Not in a fixed, rigid, there's only one way and you must do it my way or else type of way. So God works within relationship with us. And within that love relationship wants us to know his heart and choose to follow his heart, because his heart is always going to be the best and good. But we get many different ways of doing it, because he also respects our creativity and our coercion and the ability that we have to bring about his will through who we are.
I was just thinking, if there is going to be an air crash the day I'm going to fly, and he doesn't want me to die yet, so if he doesn't see the future, how can he protect me from the air crash?
Okay, well, there's a sense where heaven operates. Heaven, I'm not talking about God as in God outside of time and space. I'm saying that heaven operates in a time scale before this one. So prophecy comes out of a realm which operates, let's say, slightly ahead of this one. So things can be aware within that time space that prophetic things can warn people of. But it's not like God sees it all, because if that was the case, if God has seen the future and you died, how could he warn you not to die? Because you've already died in the future. So the future cannot have happened yet. Otherwise, you would have died and he would have had no choice but to allow you to die, because he couldn't have warned you. What he's saying is there are potential things that could happen depending on our choices. So there's multiple timelines that could exist. And he has access, and heaven has access to what may happen if those timelines are followed. So he is going to warn you about the possibility of a timeline if that choice is made, perhaps. Look at it that way. Not that you already died. Otherwise, if you'd already died, you would have already died. So he sees the possibilities of what could exist, and prophetic insight can come out of the possibilities of the choices that may be made. And in one of those choices, you might die on a plane crash. In another of those, you won't die in a plane crash, either because you don't get on the plane or because the plane isn't going to crash. Because the crash probably comes about because someone's incompetence, generally, or something has happened that someone has made a bad decision and the plane's crashed. So God can, in a sense, be aware of the possibilities of bad decisions. And I do think, in one sense, heaven functions slightly ahead of here. And there are different timescales of the speed of light in heaven, which makes the time in heaven different from it is on earth. And I think there is a connection there between how warnings can be given in that way. But it's basically all about the timelines that exist because of our choices and other people's choices and how they impinge on our lives, really.
So what was the main purpose of God creating the human race? I mean, it was the relationship, fellowship.
Yeah, absolutely. Relationship in love, wonder, harmony. God, in the joy and love that God has for himself within relationship, because Father, Son, and Spirit, God is a relational being. God wanted to share that relationship with others so others could participate in the joy, peace, and love and rest of being in relationship with him. Otherwise, he'd be selfish in a sense. And God, obviously, love isn't selfish, so love would want to share. And so God desired to share love with others, a universe. And it was his intention. And because that was his intention, he put in, let's say, some fail safes to make sure that intention ultimately could not be changed, although the process would change because of our choices.
And the relationship included also us being part of what he's doing. Like
Yes.
on the earth,
because,
the restoration of the earth, the restoration of
well,
and
that came about as us therefore participating in what Jesus engaged in on our behalf, or representing us, or identifying with us. Ultimately, there would have been no need for restoration if there had been no change. But so God has worked with it. God works within our choices. And therefore, when we made that choice, he then brings good out of our choices to bring about how that choice can still be part of actually bringing about his original intention and purpose, because he'll bring good out of it. So God is able to function that way. But relationship's only possible with choice. You can't have a love relationship if there's no choice to love.
Yeah.
But it is a difficult question, and there are lots of difficult questions, which ultimately the only solution is to trust that God is a good God and loves us. You're not going to know everything about every possible scenario that exists, and ultimately what God true love is. I love God and I trust him because I believe he's good, and therefore when I have doubts, or when there's a possibility of something that's happened which may think, well, God can't be good because this has happened, I know that can't be true because God is good, because God is love. Therefore, I choose to always align my thinking with God is love. Therefore, I'm never going to doubt, or if a doubt comes across my mind, I choose to trust him when I don't know. So me not knowing does not affect my belief and my relationship with God and my trust of him, because he is trustworthy. He is faithful. There are characteristics of God which I think enhance my ability to trust him, like faithfulness, dependability, reliability, unchangeableness. There are those type of characteristics which would mean I trust in his goodness, even when I don't understand. And there's going to be billions of things I don't understand, because in my level of maturity, I'm not capable of understanding that right now. Ultimately, as we mature, I think we will understand more. And I do believe eventually God wants us to create ourselves. Therefore, going through this process, I guess, will help us identify with how God relates to when things don't go right.
Yeah, in church here, two 14-year-olds, twins. They just lost their mother, and in a sickness, and she went to be with the father, and she was a believer. But for them, of course, it was very difficult, and one of them was very angry at God.
Yeah,
was very angry, and then he said, "Why did God take my mother?" That was why he was angry, because that's what he thought.
Yes, and I know a lot of people say things like that, in a way to try to comfort people, and they're not helping. God didn't take her; the sickness did.
Yeah.
And the sickness wasn't God's intention, but it's complex, because then he might ask, well, why didn't God heal her? And all you can say is, we don't know, because we're not God. But we know God is good, and we know that she is in a better place now from being in sickness. But actually, that is not easy for someone to actually rationalize or try and, it's an emotional thing, which is better not to try and explain it to children, but just to say, God is here to comfort you in your grief and sorrow. Now let's engage God in this. God didn't want this, but we live in a world where some things happen that are beyond our control. And God cannot just change everything, therefore, because there would be no choice and no free will, if there was not the possibility that things could happen. And again, that's hard to explain to children and things, because they think, well, God can. Why didn't God do it? Because God also has to be just and righteous. So if he did something for one, he would have to do it for all, and that would mean he would have to take free will away and take choice away.
Yeah.
Which he's not going to do. But I don't have the answers to those questions. We shouldn't try and give simplistic answers to complex questions. What we've got to do is try and encourage the things to say, let God comfort you. Let God show you how much he's loving you, and let God show you that your mother is now safe and pain-free and in a place where she's looking over you and she's part of a cloud of witnesses who are going to support you for the rest of your life. We can build on positives rather than trying to focus on trying to understand everything. And we don't. And we won't. And there are many things I don't know. Healing is a big thing. Why some people get healed and some people don't, seemingly at that point, I don't know. But I know it's complex. You never know what's in the heart or in the head of people who are either ministering to someone or being ministered to. You just don't know. You don't know the full reasons for every issue that takes place. Some of them may well be genetic variations of things that are in a family line, that are things from the past that are unresolved. Some may be the result of people doing things themselves that opens themselves up. Someone else has done something. Sometimes it's an accident. God can't stop all accidents. Because sometimes accidents they're accidents. No one intended them, but they are, because people make mistakes.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Hi, Tish. You got something you want to ask?
I'm really enjoying the discussion, because I'm working on the second book now, and it keeps taking me back to the very beginning of time and the journey of the human soul and the purpose of life on earth. And I think that's what the book is trying to explain. And yet the constant theme in the book is the love of God, and that we should trust him. Yeah. But these particular questions that Inga is asking, are questions that keep coming back to me, and I haven't cracked them. So I was listening to hear what you have to say. And even the issue of reincarnation is coming to me now. I know I've gone down that channel before, and I came back and it didn't make sense to me, but it makes sense in certain ways, and it doesn't make sense in certain ways. And I drew a conclusion that we won't understand everything. But I'm looking at the journey of the soul on the earth, the purpose, the why, the where, and the intentions behind it.
Sure. I mean, I don't believe in a pre-existent soul. I believe in a pre-existent spirit, and I believe the soul forms when the spirit comes into the body. Therefore, I don't believe anyone has existed as a person before, that would be reincarnation, is a soul was in somebody else before they came into a person. I don't believe that. I believe in a pre-existing spirit, and that spirit is tied to the same soul. Because when the soul comes into existence, the spirit, if someone dies and they don't know Jesus, goes back to the Father, waiting for the soul to be reconnected once that soul has been restored into relationship with God. If you got reincarnation, you have souls existing over and over again in people, and that would lead you down to a very Buddhist view, or you could end up in a bug. That's what reincarnation from that extreme says. Well, if you did a bad life, you might come back as a lesser being or not as a person. That's where reincarnation eventually goes if you follow that route. I don't believe there's any evidence for reincarnation, both with people or in the Bible.
So when John the Baptist is described as having the spirit of Elijah,
that's just the euphemism for he had a ministry of revealing Jesus, of a forerunner. It's nothing. It's not literal. John the
like we
Baptist.
are the Joshua generation.
I've met Elijah. John the Baptist was not Elijah, because they are two separate people. I've met both of them. They have separate spirits and souls, not the same. You're reading into something there which is completely not what it's saying. Just because it says he had the spirit of, I can have the spirit of a lion, because that means I am bold. Doesn't mean I've got the lion spirit in me. In reality, just means I'm bold. It's just a form of phrase, terminology. Doesn't mean that he had Elijah's spirit, because he couldn't have Elijah's spirit, because Elijah has his own spirit, because Elijah never died. So Elijah never gave up his spirit. His spirit still stays in him, and his soul stays in his body, because Elijah was translated into heaven without ever dying. So there's no way that John the Baptist had Elijah's actual spirit, and it doesn't say it. It doesn't say that. You got to be careful you don't read into something with an assumption of your own, trying to figure something out in your own strength.
Yeah.
You run into big issues if you go down that route by just reading one verse and prove it and creating a theology of reincarnation based on one verse.
Yeah, because I know that in this time we are walking in the spirit of Joshua and Elijah, and it doesn't mean we are Joshua's. We have the spirit we have reincarnated as Joshua or Elijah. So
no, but it's a phrase, a terminology that says, the spirit of Joshua, or in the spirit, is like forerunners, or those who are going to overcome, or those who are going to enter into the promises, or lead others into the promise. Because otherwise, only one person could have that spirit there. What about all the other people who need to operate through let's say the Joshua generation, who would carry the sort of same spirit? Like when Joshua and Caleb says they had a different spirit. Well, it didn't mean they had someone else's different spirit. It just meant their spirit was different from the other people, because they lingered in the presence of God and they knew God more intimately. That's why they had a different spirit, because their spirit was connected relationally to God, where the other of the children of Israel rejected relationship with God. Therefore, and it wasn't talking about their personal spirit either. This is the problem. We use words in English which have many different actual meanings in other languages. And therefore, when it says, Joshua and Caleb had a different spirit, it didn't mean that their spirit, actual spirit, was not human. It just meant they had a different capacity to operate in God's heart. You could have said they had God's heart, which would have been exactly the same term, just a way of saying the same thing. It didn't mean that their spirit was different as their personal human spirit. Their spirit was their spirit, but it did mean that they had, in their relationship with God, had a different way of operating. They functioned differently from others because of their relationship with God. Therefore you can use spirit, soul, heart, mind, and they all have different sort of nuances of meaning, but sometimes the words are the same in Hebrew or Greek. Sometimes they're different. So if they're different, then why did the writer choose a different word? Because they probably had a different meaning in their understanding. But it doesn't mean that we should just read into the fact when it says spirit, that it's meaning the human spirit. It can just mean a concept, if you like, of strength, or like the spirit of a lion or the heart of a lion. I've heard both of those things used to represent people who have a boldness about them, that they're not afraid. They have the spirit of a lion or the heart of a lion. I've heard that about sportsmen. he carries that because he doesn't give up. He perseveres. He's never going to give in. Well, that is not really referring to his human spirit or soul in reality. It's just saying that's the way he's wired. You could say that's to do with redemptive gift. Some people have a redemptive gift that enables them to have certain capacities. But definitely, I do not believe in reincarnation in the way that you come back into another being, because your soul would then connect to another spirit. It doesn't work that way. If you die, your spirit and soul, if you know God, go to be with God, like Paul said. Absent from the body and present with the Lord. He didn't say absent from the body and then present in another body. Otherwise, why would we have the cloud of witnesses? All of them would be reincarnated as somebody else. There would be no cloud of witnesses, would there? Because there would be somebody else. But they're not. They're the cloud of witnesses. They're the same spirit and soul as they had when they were here on earth. And they now operate in another capacity as the cloud of witnesses. You're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, the journey of the soul is very key to me right now. Yeah. And I know you've engaged in other realms where you've met other beings in other realms.
Yeah.
Did they also have souls, and did they choose to go to those realms? And I'm looking at the situation on the earth now. They all be evil going on around us. The most, and I wonder how the choices we made before we came here is expanding and into such darkness. Yet there are beings in other realms who are below us, and some are above us. What do you make of it? Is this all the journey of the soul in different realms?
No. Because you are a human being with a human soul and a human spirit. There are angelic beings that have soul, and they are a spirit being, but they have personality, they have soul. But they were created as a independent being. They weren't a race of beings. They were a independent being created that way with that soul and spirit, or as a spiritual being with a soul. They were created that way. There are other dimensions, there are other races where they were created as those races, and they have developed within those races, and they do have a spirit and soul, but they're not human. So they have capacity, but they're not human. They were created for a different purpose and different function within the whole of creation, because God is multifaceted and manifold, in that takes a lot to represent the fullness of him. And that is never going to be limited to one race. It's because he is multifaceted. Therefore, the whole of creation is a reflection of his manifoldness, if you like, multifacetedness. And we are made in his image and likeness, like no other being is, but every other being is still made from his creative ability and still reflects him in some way, or has the capacity to reflect him in some way. But you don't journey as a soul, as you were an angel, then you become a human, then you end up another dimensional being. They're all independent people and beings created by God. You don't transcend one. You can engage with them, but you can't be one, and you didn't choose to be one, because your soul didn't exist until the spirit came in the body. God made their spirits different from human spirits, because they all came from him who is spirit. Spirit, again, is such a big term. God is love, God is light, God is spirit. So another being, another spirit being, is made of spiritual material, you could say, light material, made out of light, but made in a particular way. The soul only forms as a spiritual thing, because the soul is a spirit, it's not physical, and this is where it's complex, because the soul in itself is made of spiritual material, but it's not a spirit. It's not the spirit, it's the soul. But it didn't form until your spirit came into your body, which then the life came into the body and the soul formed. That's when Adam became a living soul or a living being, when God breathed into him. He didn't exist as a soul before God breathed into him. He existed as a spirit. And when God breathed into him, the spirit came into the body and the soul formed. That's why he became a living soul. He wasn't a soul before that.
Okay. And the soul, how come our actions affect the other races?
Well, how come? Because we're connected, because we're made in the image of God to rule and have dominion over those other dimensions in love, to bring about the union and oneness and perfection of those races in love.
So could that be the races that we were to have dominion over at the very beginning? Because before our fall, Adam was created to have dominion over all things.
Yeah.
They mentioned fishes, they mentioned plants, they mentioned animals and all that, but nothing was mentioned of another race. Yet we were to have dominion of something that at that time hadn't fallen.
Yeah, but we weren't there supposed to have dominion over each other.
Not each other, yeah.
No, because we're all called to have dominion. Everyone as a child of God has the capacity for dominion. That was never intended to have dominion over each other. That's what man chose to do by creating a hierarchy that elevated him above others, which is what Lucifer did to elevate himself above the other angels. I will be like God. I will be seated on the throne. I will. That's what created racism and all of the other hierarchical things in the world, which could put people in subjection to others. That's because it's independence and selfishness, which puts me above somebody else. Because there is no hierarchy in the Trinity. They're just Father, Son, and Spirit in perfect perichoresis and union and oneness. And God has created within the angelic realm those that have functions within the angelic realm. But there's still not a hierarchy in the one subjugates the other, just they have different roles. And within that context, God creates us with different roles, but that doesn't make us better than anybody else. It just makes us that we're fearfully and wonderfully made with a role. And therefore our spirit has a destiny that then becomes our destiny when we become a living being. But that destiny is never going to be somebody else or something else. You're never going to be another person or another animal or another race or another dimensional being. You are you. You are a human being made in the image and likeness of God in a way that none of the rest of creation is. That's the difference between mankind and the centrality of man on the earth as a gateway to all the other dimensions, which is why there's such contention over the earth and man, and such the want and desire for man's DNA to hybridize and create beings that will have man's capacity but not be men. That's been Lucifer's intention, has been trying to pollute or pervert or create hybrids that would have man's capabilities, but they don't. Never works, because only we are made in the image and likeness of God as sons of God. Now, the angels are called sons of God or Ben Elohim, but they're not created as a race. And Jesus, in a sense, did not identify with them in the same way he identifies with us. Before the foundation of the world, it's man's ability to be restored to sonship, which will bring about the restoration of the rest of creation. It will never happen independently of us, which is why, there's such contention over the souls of people and them discovering their identity as sons of God and being restored and reconciled into that relationship again. There's such deception and such darkness trying to keep people from the truth of who they are, because the enemy is a liar and will lie to prevent people understanding who they really are. But I don't believe you'll ever be anybody else, or you have the capacity to be anybody else. The only possibility of where that has taken place is where people's souls linger on earth, do not immediately go back into the realms of heaven or back into the fire of God's presence, and they haunt people, if you like, or they can engage people and affect people from within. So just like, alien humans, lingering human souls, I would call them, do have the capacity to linger, and they need then to, if they're affecting people, then people need to be delivered from that infection, if you like. But that's but that doesn't mean that they're you. It just means that they try and influence you to be like them, because they're trying to outwork their personality like a demon would. But they're just unclean spirits that have not passed over yet. But they're not you. They're just making you feel you might be a mixture. And some people do feel that they're like, who are they? Because they've got these competing souls within them. But that's not a majority. It's not, everybody. It's some that don't pass over, and they can be helped to pass over, and they can be, delivered from people to pass over. So that is the only thing where potentially two souls could be in the same body. But that's two souls in the same body competing, not one soul in someone else's body.
Yeah.
Without there being that person's soul.
Okay. So the beings in other realms that you have encountered, do they have souls?
Yes. Yeah, of course. They're beings. They're races of beings. They have a spirit and a soul. They're just not human.
So they have the spirit of Father, and they are created into a different form with their own race soul.
Totally, yeah. And some of them are not humanoid. Some of them are look completely different from anything you could ever imagine or think life would have. They're not all humanoid. Some of them are humanoid, look very different from us. Some of them have totally different things because they're made to reflect the create. Why did God create all the different animals and all the different species? And why is there such beauty and such magnificent versatility and stuff? And why is there such variety? Because God is not boring, And so he has made other races to reflect other aspects of him. Now, I'm not God, so I can't give you the answers to every reason why God created everything the way he did. I just know he has. And I've met, I don't know, how many have I met? Probably approaching 100 different races.
Wow.
From dimensions. So, and they're all very different. Now, they're all looking to sons of God to bring about their restoration. Some of them never fell. So some of them never fell in the first place. So they're still functioning in their original, but they're still not complete because they still need connection with us, because we're co-heirs in creation. None of them are co-heirs. No angel is a co-heir. Only sons of God are co-heirs.
So is that the difference? Is that why we are the restorers?
Yeah. Yeah, because we're made in the image and likeness of God. They're just made because we're a tripart being, made in the image and likeness of God, but with a sonship capacity. Whereas they're sons of God in a sense of they're all children of God because they're all being created by him as creator. But they don't have the same capacity as we do. And they were never given dominion over the whole of creation to bring about harmony and peace and wholeness and to administrate in love. So they need to know love. They need to be loved. They need to experience God's love through us who need to love them. So that's our thing. I mean, if you're going to write the second book from the point of reincarnation, you're going to run into a whole load of problems. You
No,
won't
no, no.
get an endorsement for me on it.
It's
For
definitely
sure.
not reincarnation at all.
No, but
It's
there
already
is a connection.
it's already done. It's just, I think, the issue of the human soul. Some questions have been coming to me, and I just thought I'll look at that again. But no, definitely not reincarnation, no. Because I can't see where to put reincarnation in all that, unless no.
But the human soul has to reconnect the memory of the human spirit, because the human spirit has memory from being here before, and therefore the process of reconnecting brings you into the eternal knowledge of who you were before you're here. The memory of the soul here obviously goes through all sorts of experiences from the outside in, mostly, that shape the human soul here, from fallenness, from lost identity. So when you get restored to God and restored through Jesus, then you discover your true identity. Then you go for a renewal of the mind to remove the negative aspects of the soul's memory and trauma and experiences, to bring about the reconnection to the eternal spirit and the memory of who we were before we were here, which gives you a whole enhanced version of identity.
The last time you mentioned something, you mentioned did you say the 12 levels of humanity, or we are the 12 humans or something?
No, 12 ages of man.
What's that? What is that?
Well, there are 12 levels of ascension that man was designed to go through. And therefore, ultimately, that relates to the 9 firestones that were there. Lucifer, represented. Lucifer walked in the garden of God, and the firestones were in the garden of God. And those 9 firestones represented the 9 stones that were on Lucifer's body, to reflect at the glory of our sonship, so we could come into that reality. But there were always going to be 12 stones, because there is 12 stones on the high priest breastplate and 12 foundational stones to the New Jerusalem. Therefore, there are 3 more firestones that need to come out of us, that are to do with our sonship, completing the government of God. Because 9 is complete number, and God is completely complete in 3 by 3 by 3. And the number 9 always is complete. So whenever you multiply 9, you always get 9. Like if you think of 2 9s are 18, 1 and 8 is 9, 3 9s are 27, 2 and 7 are 9, 4 9s are 36, 3 and 6 is 9, always complete. But the government of God is 12. Therefore, he's added in sonship and the 3 stones of sonship to the 12. And therefore, there's the levels of ascension which will go beyond the restoration of just the earth and creation. So there's more to come, let's say.
Wow. Yes, thank you.
It's interesting stuff. And ultimately, we are bit by bit, as we're restored and our minds are being renewed, are reconnecting to our eternal destiny and purpose and identity. And that does require the eternal element of that for it to be complete. Otherwise, you've only got the journey of the soul on earth and not the reconnection to the memory of the spirit, which is why that is what's taking place in the renewal of our minds. The spirit is remapped over, because the spirit has a consciousness as well as the soul having a consciousness, but they need to become one and reintegrated and made whole, because they were never designed to be separate. But independence, man chose independence, and that is what separated the soul and spirit from when the spirit and soul are within the body. They're separated and need reintegration. But we need to be reintegrated back to God first, so that the reintegration of our spirit, soul, and body can take place within our relationship with Father, Son, and Spirit.
Oh dear. So it's the separation that actually blocked our memory.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did. But that's why reintegration will bring about a restoration of that. And ultimately, our spiritual consciousness needs to be remapped over our physical consciousness so they become one. And then we begin to perceive everything from a spiritual reality and not a natural reality first. And a lot of people still see things only through a natural perspective, not an eternal one. So.